He was once a true icon of rock and roll, with a voice that could tear through the air and a gaze that seemed to challenge the world itself. But behind the cheers and the spotlight was a body worn down and a soul that never found peace. Throughout his life, he seemed drawn into a constant whirlwind of collisions, on stage, in the streets, and within his own private world. One accident after another left scars not only on his skin, but deep within his mind. Some friends said he had a way of walking into trouble as if it had been waiting for him. Others believed it was fate, a fragile thread leading every step toward his final end. And when that end came, it left many wondering, was it all just a tragic chain of coincidences? Or was there something else, something deeper that he never spoke of? Stay with us as we trace the life of Gene Vincent. Chapter 1. From a night of fireworks to a lifetime of tragedy. Norfolk, the night of July 4th, 1955. Fireworks exploded in the sky, and on the ground, the sound of crushing metal. On a dark street, a brand new Triumph motorcycle lay on its side, the wheel still spinning. The smell of gunpowder mingled with gasoline spilling across the pavement. Beside it, Vincent Eugene Craddock, just 20 years old, a U.S. Navy sailor, lay motionless. His uniform trousers were torn open, blood pooling across the sidewalk. When he woke in the Naval Hospital, Gene heard the cold words, "We have to take the leg." He shook his head. "Keep it for me." The surgery lasted for hours. His left leg was saved, but it was now held together by steel braces, bolts, and scars. From hip to ankle, he wore a brace every day. Every step from then on carried the memory of that Independence Day night. Months later, a different version of the story began circulating, that Gene had been injured in the Korean War. A noble detail, but not a true one. Who started that story, and why? Before the young man on the Triumph, Gene was a boy born in 1935 in Norfolk, Virginia. An only child in a working-class family, his father served in the Coast Guard during World War II. The family moved often, spending time in Princess Anne County running a small grocery store. Gene grew up surrounded by country and gospel music from the church, and rhythm and blues from the family radio. At 12, he got his first guitar. Clumsy at first, but within months, he could mimic the blues riffs that were sweeping the airwaves. That was when Gene began dreaming of something bigger than small-town life. At 17, he lied about his age to join the Navy. Maybe he thought the sea would be his life. But fate changed in a single moment. The accident on that Independence Day ended his naval career and sent him back to Norfolk. By day, he drifted between bars. At night, he held his guitar, ready to join any band that would let him on stage. Offstage, Gene was soft-spoken and reserved. But when the music began, he transformed. Eyes alight, voice raspy, his injured foot still pounding in time with the drums. When he played, you forgot he even had a limp, one friend remembered. The accident didn't just leave scars on his leg. It split Gene into two halves, the quiet young sailor and the explosive artist who played each show as if it were his last. From that night on, Gene's fate seemed bound to collisions, on the road and in life itself. But did his story truly begin with the music, or with the sound of metal shattering under fireworks that night? Chapter 2. The Be-Bop-a-Lula, Breakthrough and the Pressure Behind the Curtain. Norfolk, summer of 1956. A small bar near the docks, neon lights flickering against the glass door, the air thick with cigarette smoke. On a makeshift stage, a local band was struggling to pull the crowd closer. Then, the owner gave a quick wave to Gene. He stepped up, limping. The guitar hung off one shoulder, his left leg strapped into a metal brace that gleamed under the lights. A few murmurs rose from the crowd. If he can't even walk right, how's he gonna play? But the moment Gene started to sing, the whispers vanished. The song was Be-Bop-a-Lula, a fresh slice of rockabilly. His voice was husky, full of rhythm, but there was something else. At the end of each line, there was a faint ache, as if he were singing with both his breath and the memory of that Triumph lying in the street. When he leaned into the mic, the metal brace caught the light. an image both powerful and fragile. They say that night, a young sailor stumbled up to the stage and asked, "Did you get hurt in Korea?" Gene only smiled and said nothing. It was the first time the war injury rumor began creeping into his story. No one knew if Gene started it or simply let it grow on its own. But it gave him the air of an accidental war hero, and in music that had its own kind of currency. After the show, a local guitarist invited Gene to join the Blue Caps. They weren't just a band, they were drifters, ready to play anywhere. Weddings, bars, even prisons. Gene agreed without hesitation. Within weeks, they landed a demo session at Capitol Studio. As the drums, bass, and guitar kicked in, Gene shouted into the mic, "Well, Be-Bop-a-Lula, she's my baby." That blast catapulted them from Virginia's shoreline onto the national charts. But the explosion came with a strange footnote. The original Be-Bop-a-Lula wasn't exactly new. Some claim Gene had been singing it for months at nameless Norfolk gigs, but when it hit vinyl, the lyrics had been altered, and the songwriting credits were shared with people who had never once been on stage with him. Who made that decision? And why did Gene never speak out? From a tiny bar, he became rock and roll's newest star. But under the stage lights and the cheers, Gene was already learning how to keep quiet about the things better left unsaid. Chapter 3. International Stardom, the price of a damaged leg. By 1957, Be-Bop-a-Lula had made Gene Vincent a household name. Leather jacket, tight jeans, the metal brace beneath his left pant leg. That image showed up on magazine covers, album sleeves, and theater posters. With the Blue Caps, he roamed the United States, playing before thousands of screaming fans. On stage, Gene was like a bullet leaving the barrel, tearing straight into his audience, leaving doubt behind. But when the lights went down, the air shifted. One bandmate recalled, "Some nights, right after we left the stage, Gene would sit by himself, staring off at nothing. We'd ask him something, and he'd give a short answer, then walk away." The grind of constant touring began to wear them down. Every night, a new city, a new hotel, and a stack of contracts. Some nights, Gene needed painkillers just to make it onto the stage. His left leg never fully healed. A traveling doctor once advised him to take a few months off, but Gene just smiled. "If I stop, I'll disappear." Meanwhile, rock and roll was under fire. Conservative journalists called it the music of sin, and parents feared its influence. Gene became an easy target, a young man dressed like a rebel, limping, singing about love and freedom. Then came a strange incident in Philadelphia. After a show, the organizers reported that several expensive pieces of sound equipment were missing. Rumors quickly spread that someone in the band had helped themselves. No proof surfaced, but a few local papers ran headlines hinting at Gene's involvement. When asked, he simply said, "We came here to play music, not to steal." But someone who'd been backstage told another version. "I saw Gene arguing with his manager just before word of the missing gear got out. He was loud, but we couldn't hear what they were saying." Whatever the truth, the episode made Capitol Records start watching Gene's every move. The pressure from the label, the media, and the relentless schedule began creating cracks, the kind the audience would never see when he was in the spotlight. And then, one September night, driving back from a gig, the band's car nearly plunged into a ditch when a front tire exploded. No one was hurt, but for Gene, it was just the second little accident since the motorcycle crash of 1955. Was it coincidence, or was fate beginning to repeat itself? Chapter 4. The Death of Eddie Cochran and the Shadow That Never Let Go. By the early 1960s, rock and roll had changed. New faces were taking over. The Beatles, the Stones, and the music was shifting in a different direction. But Gene Vincent kept moving from stage to stage, clinging to the fading light of his glory days. That crushed left leg was now a constant source of pain. Every step reminded him of that night in Norfolk back in 1955. Still, Gene refused to rest. "If I stop, they'll forget me," he told a friend. Then, in April 1960, fate struck again. Gene was in London for a tour with Eddie Cochran. After one show, they climbed into an Austin taxi to head back to their hotel. Rain slicked the streets. The driver lost control, and the car slammed into a lamppost. Eddie Cochran was killed instantly. Gene was thrown from his seat, his head taking a hard blow, his injured left leg damaged even further. One police officer who responded to the crash later recalled that Gene was silent in a way that chilled you during the rescue. Later, Gene only said one thing: "I told him to wear his seatbelt." No one could say if that was the truth, or just what Gene needed to believe to ease the guilt. The accident made walking harder than ever, forcing him to lean heavily on his brace. But it left something else behind: nightmares. A friend who shared a hotel room on tour said that in the middle of the night, Gene would bolt upright, scream Eddie's name, then go silent as if nothing had happened. From then on, strange incidents seemed to follow him. In 1961, in Germany, a group of drunken youths blocked him after a show. A beer bottle shattered near his face, a shard slicing across his cheek and leaving a faint scar under the stage lights. No one was ever arrested. In 1963, in California, Gene's rental car was hit from behind while parked outside his hotel. No one ever came forward as the owner of the other car. His manager called it the strangest thing I've ever seen. To audiences, these were random accidents, but to Gene, each one was another knife wound to a mind already covered in scars. An old friend recalled, "Gene believed something was following him, like an invisible hand pushing him toward trouble." And then, one night in Texas, in the middle of a song, Gene suddenly froze. His hand gripped the microphone tight. His face went pale. Moments later, he walked off stage without a word. When they found him backstage, Gene just shook his head. "I saw something, and it's not from here." Was it only trauma? Or had Gene begun to believe in a curse? Chapter 5. A chain of strange accidents and the question of fate. By the mid-1970s, the name Gene Vincent was no longer heard on the radio. Record contracts were rare. Most shows were now in small bars or at local fairs. The crowds made up of people who had lived through rock and roll's earliest days. The money he earned barely covered medical bills and cheap travel. His crippled left leg was getting worse. Doctors urged him to quit performing altogether, but Gene forced a thin smile. "If I'm not on stage, then who am I?" Yet his public appearances grew increasingly erratic. Some nights, he arrived more than an hour late, stepping on stage with a faraway look in his eyes. Other nights, he would stop mid-song, staring into the front row, as if searching for someone. One friend said, "He told me he saw a familiar face, but couldn't remember where he'd met them. And when I turned to look, there was no one there." The accidents didn't stop either. Once, a tire on Gene's car blew out on the highway, nearly sending it into a ditch. Another time, an electrical short in a recording studio sent sparks onto his shirt, scorching the fabric. No one was hurt, but the constant mishaps led some to whisper that something's following Gene. In September 1971, Gene was admitted to a California hospital with severe stomach bleeding. The official cause? Complications from ulcers, worsened by years of travel and drinking. But a nurse later said Gene didn't want long-term treatment, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. After leaving the hospital, he stayed temporarily at his mother's home in California. Neighbors remembered him sitting alone on the porch at midnight, no lights on, smoking in silence. One even recalled hearing him mumble Eddie Cochran's name over and over. On October 12, 1971, Gene Vincent died at the age of 36. The cause listed on the death certificate: stomach bleeding and heart failure. There was no accident right before the end, but for those who believed in his chain of fateful collisions, his death felt like the final step in a path long set in motion. An old friend said at the funeral, "If you look back at everything that happened, it's like every step was leading him here. Was it nothing more than a string of misfortunes, or the work of an unseen hand?" Chapter 6. The Final Days and the Call. No one could explain. Gene Vincent's funeral was a quiet affair in California. No swarm of reporters, no parade of Hollywood stars, just a few dozen relatives, old friends, and musicians who had once shared a stage with him. A handful of loyal fans drove hundreds of miles just to stand outside the funeral home, listening through the closed doors as a cassette player near the casket played Be-Bop-a-Lula softly into the room. The casket remained closed. One friend explained, "I think they did it to preserve the best image of Gene. In his final months, he had wasted away, his face hollow, his body frail. Nobody wanted to remember him like that." But not everyone believed the story ended there. A former manager insisted he had received a call from Gene just a week before his death. During that call, Gene mentioned an old matter that needed to be settled and promised they would meet to talk it over. But that meeting never happened. A neighbor claimed to have seen a strange man standing outside Gene's house 2 days before he went into the hospital. He didn't knock, the neighbor said, just stood there, smoking, then walked away. No one ever identified him. Some whispered that the string of accidents in Gene's life had not been mere chance, from the blown tire to the studio fire that scorched his shirt to his falls on stage. They seemed like deliberate blows, wearing down his body and mind, pushing him toward an inevitable breaking point. A few even brought up that night in 1960 in England when Eddie Cochran died in a car crash and Gene walked away. Maybe, they said, he never escaped the shadow of that night, and fate was simply waiting for the moment to close the circle. The press barely covered his passing. Rock and roll had moved on, and pioneers like Gene survived only in the memories of an older generation. But for those who had once seen him command a stage, his death was an irreplaceable loss. One friend summed it up through tears. He didn't just die from illness. He died from a lifetime of collisions, both literal and figurative. So did Gene Vincent simply succumb to a body worn out? Or was there something else? Something we've never been told. Epilogue, legacy, loss, and the question that will never be answered. There are artists whose deaths dominate the headlines, and then there are those, like Gene Vincent, who leave this world so quietly that days pass before the news spreads, and when it does, all that remains is a void that can't be filled. Gene Vincent reshaped the face of rock and roll. A young man with a crippled leg, survivor of a fateful night in Norfolk in 1955, still stepping onto the stage in leather pants, voice blazing, making the world take notice. He paved the way for Elvis, the Beatles, the Stones, yet died almost forgotten, in a modest home far from the spotlight. The irony haunts those who remember. How could a man who once made audiences scream end up fighting for money until his last breath? How could someone who survived so many accidents, on the road and on the stage, finally be brought down by a stomach ulcer, bleeding out before anyone could save him? Scattered clues remain. The old matter phone call a week before his death, the unknown man at his door, the chain of strange accidents, all still lying there, unconnected. To some, they're nothing but coincidence. To others, they're the stones laid on a path fate had built, leading Gene to a dark and certain end. His death also rekindled the tragedy of Eddie Cochran, the friend who died right before his eyes in that 1960 crash. Perhaps Gene carried an invisible wound from that night, the kind no doctor could heal. And maybe every collision that followed, in every sense of the word, only made it bleed more, until he could no longer get back up. When he died, there was little left in terms of possessions. A few guitars, some music royalties, and mementos from his glory days. No public will. Family and friends quietly divided what remained, as if protecting one last secret for a man who had lived so much of his life in the public eye. But Gene Vincent's true legacy isn't in money or contracts. It's in the way he made rock and roll wilder, bolder, and more real. Every time Be-Bop-a-Lula plays, whether from an old radio or at a tribute concert, you can still picture him. Hair slicked back, eyes part challenge, part invitation, voice like gasoline catching fire. For those who lived through the 50s and 60s, Gene is part of their memory. For younger listeners, he's a name worth rediscovering, not just to hear the music, but to understand that behind every legend, there's a human being. A man who loved, who raged, who stumbled, and who finally vanished into questions that may never be answered. You could say Gene Vincent's death was the inevitable result of illness, a hard life, age, and exhaustion. Or you could believe it was the final chapter in a book fate had begun writing on that Norfolk night in 1955, when fireworks mingled with the sound of crushing metal. We'll never know for certain, and maybe that uncertainty is what keeps Gene Vincent's story alive.